Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Cartographer weekly community meeting. Today is November 10th, and well, let's get started. Sorry for the confusion. That probably some of you saw something different in the Outlook calendar. Only to keep, we moved the community meeting 1 hour forward, but just to keep it at the same 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 Eastern time. And that will be the case until March 14, I believe, when daylight savings time it starts again. Okay, yeah, please make sure to add your name to the attendee list. It's completely optional. It's optional, but it's nice to have it there. I don't know if we have new users joining. Not yet. Okay. So now for the TLDR, thank you. I don't know if it was Josh adding the content here in the TLDR, but thank you for that.
Yep, I added a bunch of those things. Yeah, what's new in the project this week? In delivery, we've got a PR that's ready for review for promoting a deployment. So that's pretty exciting. You can have a look at that link right there. The other thing that we got in was using informers in a lot of places. So like monitoring the stamped objects that a supply chain produces, as well as monitoring like the templates as they change. And there's two different PRs that people can take a look at for those two different bits of work. Yeah, those two different ones. And then so what's the team working on now? I posted the link to the project board again. So everyone can take a look at everything that's going on. But the big things we're looking at is the supply chain. We are going to reduce the set of roles that a controller gets. This is a breaking change, but basically we want to limit the scope of what a controller can do to a given workload. And the way we're going to model that is by using the service account that's in the same namespace as the workload which it's operating on. So in that case, the controller would only get the permissions that the workload has in that namespace.
Hey.
So that's that one. And then just a bit of a preview of what's up next. Next thing we're going to be looking at is an overhaul of how we do logging in the system. We just want to be more diligent about log levels and what we log. So we're going to be reviewing everything related to logging.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, I believe issue 51 is really important. It's one of the first things you find in the README of the project, this control permissions issue. You go there, you see what's cartographer, and the next thing is this issue. So I believe it's important to
Yep.
have a solution for that.
Definitely.
Thanks, Josh. Well, I believe that lead us to the next point. A little follow up from the previous meeting. We had a large discussion there, and one of the action items was to work on finalizing RFC 003. So just to remember that it's related to the discussion we had last week regarding RFC 14. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
I think the place we landed was RFC 3 we're not going to do in favor of RFC 14.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, we can put on, is that, oh. Yeah, sorry, I see, I see my name is Wishuma, question mark, next to this. I'll turn that into a Wishima period and close 3 and
Okay,
work on finalizing 14.
cool. Great. Thank you. All right. This week there's a new RFC 15 by Rush. So I don't know if Rush would like to discuss this briefly.
Yeah, sure. Can you click on it so I can even remember where we're up to?
Sorry.
All good. All right, and this is the worst way for it to be laid out. I'm sorry. If you actually go to main and have a look at the RFC 15.
Okay, or do you want to share your screen?
Sure, I can do that. How's that for a plan? Let me get it open instead. All right. Oh, of course it's not working.
I just posted a link in the chat.
Thank you. That will be easier than me trying to, sorry, not Slack. Apparently I can't find my Zoom. There it is. Zoom likes to hide. Okay. Oh, I did a good job with the draft. Look at that. So the idea of this one is that is in a lot of use cases there are supply chains that handle doing multiple chores, work, behaviors, and then there's different permutations of those supply chains. I've got some examples that could come up, but the kinds of characteristics a supply chain might resolve for is like the type of work. Here there's a type called job where people just want a workload to end in a job being executed. I'm thinking in terms of like agents. I don't know if that makes sense in the Kubernetes world, but it sure makes sense as like runnables and other infrastructures. And then another thing would be what sort of input will be provided for these workloads, whether they're going to run tests and what kind of tests they'll run. When it comes to Tecton, we imagine that a developer would have to provide a Tecton pipeline. So by specifying that they want a Tecton, that their workload is going to give a Tecton pipeline, it would be nice to be able to select for that. There might be scanning. And the problem we have with all of these different characteristics of the workload is that if we were to just use a single selector the way we've designed it currently, we would have a lot of permutations of supply chains, and not necessarily all the ones that we need either. So the solution, the proposed solution, is to be able to specify selectors with different characteristics that could then match, provide workloads with different characteristics would then match the most suitable supply chain. And the general rule would be that the workload would be selected by a perfect match. So all of the things are the same, but if not, then an overmatch, which does not match any other supply chain more perfectly. And one of the alternatives I talked about, and possibly an alternative that's not exclusive, that we could do both, is that it might be nice to be able to select on the kind of other values in the spec of the workload, such as is it using Git or image? Talking about a Tecton pipeline, was there a parameter for a Tecton pipeline to be passed in? That kind of thing. Yeah, so that's the broad strokes on this.
So yeah, I think that that last bit is really the key, where this RFC is proposing we stay with strict matching on labels, and then it's a question of how do we handle multiple labels. Uh, so would you agree with that characterization?
Well, I think that I specify how we should handle labels, which is that if we match perfectly, we win. If there is an overmatch, that is to say that so now I've got to remember which way I mean by overmatch. I should have made that a little bit more clear. Will only be selected by when there are more possible matches in the supply chain. So if the supply chain is for web image, then we would select for any one of these three, for example, because there was at least a couple that matched up that would do the work. I think that's what I intended here. Sorry, I wrote this out in a rush. I thought I was being logical at the time. We might have to dive back into that.
I think that makes sense, right? I think it's like the way I've been thinking about it is that the supply chains indicate what characteristics they require. And then the workload kind of like indicates what characteristics like it supports on its side. And then they get matched up so that a workload has to match all the characteristics of the supply chain. And then once we've found all the supply chains that we match, we take the one with the most matches. And that represents like a best match situation. And in the event where we hit, where we match against two supply chains that have the most number of matching labels, I think that's an error case, because then it's kind of, it's unclear which supply chain should process the workload at that point.
I think something I like about that is that it really maximizes the portability of the workload. So if you bring your workload to a different supply chain that has less labels on it, and that's still still matches the most things, if that makes sense, your application still runs in that context. So I really like the proposal. Just a little bit of feedback on the motivation. I kind of get the sense that it's the view is like a developer is choosing what kind of policies apply to their workload, but I think I view it more like the platform is deciding what policies to apply to a workload. And currently, for some things like testing, right, it makes sense that the developer has to kind of indicate, because we don't have field selectors or things like that yet, that there's some thing that the workload is kind of requires, if that makes sense. But for like scanning, does it make sense for the developer to decide when their application gets scanned, or does it make more sense for the platform to say scanning is a requirement for applications? Like the
Well, yeah,
seems a
but
little inverted.
I get that, but it's like that's a decision for the platform, right? So if the platform decides, the supply chain is always going to have a security scan in it, then it doesn't matter whether that's specified here. I'm over specifying for a broader audience, all right? That, hey, maybe you want to be able to select on these things, right?
Yep.
At that point, I would just say you just take this out and say that's not a characteristic.
Right.
We don't support that as a characteristic. We support that as that's how you're going to get it, right?
It's maybe not the best use of the best match label selectors necessarily. For something like scanning, that might be a policy. But I understand why it's an example there, if that makes sense. It's not a criticism. It's just something.
Yeah. I was just trying to make this the feeling of combinatorial explosion. Really, that's why I put it there, and I was looking for examples, right? But you can imagine some kind of combinatorial explosion, and having a bunch of very specific, and also like I think the thing I was trying to point out. This is supposed to be a mutation here. This was where I was supposed to be pointing out. You could have said web image test scan, or you could have said web test image scan. The point being is that with combinatorial explosion and having only a single selector, you've now got a string you've got to know how to form, rather than just say, these are the things I am. I should fix that, obviously. That ain't right.
So is there a world that you could be, as a developer, you could skip the scan?
I think there's like a fine line in I think there's a fine line in cartographers. I think certain platforms are going to say absolutely not. All right. And I think other people might say, well, yeah, let's make that possible, because maybe we've got a bunch that I don't know, we trust the scan. I think I've heard people talk about how if it's built by a builder that is already going to make sure that the correct objects, the CVE safe objects are installed, then there's no point in scanning.
I was just wondering from the examples, if I just wonder if we call out as a developer, if I create a workload without the scan label, am I expecting scan to be added on by the platform, or can it be avoided? As a developer, am I going to be able to work around getting away what the platform does? It's just almost calling out that. Maybe it's just worth having an example, just calling out like a bullet point, just to say that's, you wouldn't be able to, as a developer, you're not able to skip certain policies applied by the platform.
It would just depend which supply chains are in the platform, right? Like if there was a supply chain in the platform that allowed no scanning and you don't include the label, then you might match against that one and skip the scanning. But as long as there's no supply chain in the platform that does not do scanning, doesn't matter if it's a label or not, because the supply chain you'll match against will have scanning.
Yeah, maybe we can just surface that in a paragraph as an example or something like that, so it's kind of clear.
I wonder if like using scanning as an example for best match labels, like it kind of might trigger people into feeling like, we're intending for.
Yeah, let me get rid of it. Let me get rid of it so I don't have to write that paragraph, because I don't think it's even relevant. Right. So I think that just using the word scan has derailed folks. I'll get rid of it, and we'll.
Maybe you could give it an example that's something that's more developer centric, like, the developer wants to get a code quality report on the thing or something,
Yeah.
Because that would be the sort of thing that an operator would want a developer to select on if, they were.
Sure.
I think in the future, if there's some fields like you're providing a pre-built image, and pre-built images need to be scanned, but images built using the system's build tool don't need to be scanned, right? We could introduce a system for enforcing that if this field is set, right, on the workload, then a scan always happens, otherwise it doesn't. And then it's policy-based and not something the developer chooses. Maybe when we're talking about best match labels, at least in this context, it's not that we don't want to solve something like this for scanning in the future. It's just simpler to explain without that concept.
100%. And in fact, yeah, I mean, that's why I'm saying it's completely separate, right? If in that scenario, you don't want the workload to specify whether it's in or out, you want it to be inferable, right? I'm down with that. I just, and like I said, I was just looking for words that would help me with permutations, not anything really very concrete here. So I'll just drop it, and I think it'll throw less spanners into rationalizing this.
On a similar vein, though, should the developer be able to say it's Tecton is going to be doing that? Is that not like an implementation thing from the platform?
Fairly specific in this case, because they have to provide a pipeline. If Tecton could run if there was certain testing that you could run that was sort of like separate, or certain validations are going to be generic enough that you can run them, right? Like a static analysis tool, which would probably still have to select on the language that it discovers. So in the case of like when you can specify a pipeline that as an operator, like from a from either a supply chain or a template perspective. If you can do that, then again, it falls into the same bucket as why we're removing scan. It's a thing that you can enforce. Developer has no say, right? But this is about the situation where a developer would have a say. They have a Tecton pipeline that is specifically designed to test their application, right? Not to test something else. Not generic.
More of a capability and less of a policy. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just from a perception of, as a developer, if I'm adding labels to select what happens to this workload, and is test one of those things that I should be allowed to select.
I think one of the key things to keep in mind too is like, maybe the developer isn't the one actually applying these labels, right? It could be something that's done by the platform automatically based on certain characteristics, like based on certain fields in your workload itself. And so I think we need that flexibility to say like, hey, these are things that could be provided by the developer, but not necessitate it, so that we can remain flexible on the OSS side about like how the matching happens.
This is definitely optional propositions. That's why scan is still okay. It's just it's throwing a spanner in the thinking, right? These are optional propositions. I would say that you're not allowed to skip testing is also something that an operator can suggest. And when they do that, they don't match on it as a characteristic. They don't say to the developers, hey, you'll need to do, label test Tecton. They will say, give us the Tecton parameter or this will fail. And we will see that because we'll see parameter for the Tecton pipeline was not passed in. The workload goes into a status of not ready with an unmatched field. So that's already supported, right? If that's the approach that the operators wish to take. If they want to let someone select or opt in and out, this is how they could do so. And that's why I think this is down the bottom when I was talking about selecting on fields. That's why I personally feel like this is always going to be non-exclusionary. We should be able to support selecting on fields. So you might decide to add the Tecton pipeline support supply chain only when you see a field that actually has the param for that pipeline. But you might also choose to give the developer an opportunity to select in or out, which would be a characteristic that they could select in a label. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just having, if we can have those scenarios, maybe it's not for this, but it's like when documenting the feature, it's just having explained some of those scenarios, then I think that just goes away to help explain what the experience a developer is going to have.
Oh, we can definitely put more use cases on this, right? And I think I can explain both of those as a way to, I think, elegantly describe the fact that I believe we should implement both. I just don't think, I think the quickest and easiest way to keep us moving forward was to start with the label selectors, because that opens up the world of possibilities for supply chains without heavy templating and field selectors and YTT and that sort of stuff. Which I think is the ultimate goal here, right? To make the supply chains a little easier to reason about.
Yeah, no, it's just, yeah, that sounds good. If we have those scenarios, it just, all the only way I'm coming from is not to give the impression to a developer that by removing a selector, they can choose to not select certain behaviors like scanning and test. And that's just from a plain devil's advocate, it could be assumed that way. I think if you just call that out, that's not what this is about, then I think that satisfies.
It is sometimes what this is about. So I think we'll have to call that out. It is,
yeah,
hey, we're flexible enough that if that's what you want to do that, right? The person in control is the operator. So, and the operator needs to know that I guess that's the scenarios we'll come up with here. In a case where an operator is suggesting that you can, where the developer can opt in or out, they can use labels, they can use selectors, characteristics. In the case where they want to enforce it, they could use, they could avoid using those characteristics and just enforce it by putting it in their supply chain. And in the case where they don't want to when they want to enforce it. I've got it in my head. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to write it down, but I understand the expectation.
Because then on the workload input, I wondered if you even need that, because if you specify spec.image, then it's an image. If you specify spec.getref, then it's a getref. So don't necessarily need that selector.
Don't necessarily.
Right.
That's right. But in the case of the test, for example, if you specify workload spec param or workload params, I forget where params live. Is it in spec? Spec params, tecton pipeline name, and a tecton pipeline, right? Two options might present themselves to the operator in terms of what they want to control. They might say, we always have to have one, in which case there is no characteristic available. There is that field, and there is a pipeline that expects that param, it expects that param to be fulfilled, or it will fail. Or they might say, and it can be optional, right? They can choose to do it or not do it. And the easier way is to select by a characteristic. That way, when it's absent, that's an error, not a opt out. So to be a little clearer, if I was writing the workload and I said characteristic testing, and I failed to put in the field, then I get an error that told me I forgot to do something. Whereas if I put in something and I forgot to put in the field, it would never actually run because I chose not to have that characteristic regardless of the fact. And that's back to Stephen's point about portable workloads, right? It makes them more portable. I like field selectors a lot. I just don't know which we want to work on first here.
I get the point. For field selectors, but I just don't know. I'm just trying to work through on workloads, because do we want to be able to provide those selectors, those optional selectors on workloads, rather than just decide what's needed based on what's in the spec or whatever, to then the controller work out what selectors for templates and various other things needs to be chosen. But yeah, no, I'll wait for those scenarios, and that'll probably clear up.
Well, I think there's still another value that's a little harder to grok out of this one, which is the idea that you can install a lot of templates this way and then make choices later. I don't know if that's well defined, but like as an operator, you can install a bunch of default templates, the default supply chains, ones that you want to have on the platform, and you can install them this way much more readily, because you can then allow the decision to happen up front on the workload before it gets, and this is again back to the case of where sometimes a workload will be specified by tooling, but this way you can install a pipeline that's going to require testing and one that isn't going to require testing, and then choose to elevate to requiring testing later by removing the one that won't match. So there's another use case, and I think we need to capture that in some way, because I think that's the core of where this was driven from, was the ability to get started really quickly when you're using Cartographer. And whatever the platform's providing in terms of supply chains, you could use them all, and then we can start to limit what you can do by just removing them, rather than having you think up front about the kind of supply chains you're involving.
This is a
Quick
great discussion.
call out.
Just briefly,
I just wanted to.
No problem. Go ahead, Vibhusham.
I just want the overmatch part of characteristics would then require that we're giving up on, or we're foreclosing the ability to have two supply chains match on one workload. And I think that's something that in the past I've thought there would be use cases that would come up for that. I don't. I've been noodling and have become less and less have thought it less and less likely. But if this is the RFC that's going to close that door, we should make sure that.
the door is already closed. It could be opened again. I think the feeling here is that you're saying that this will continue to cement the door closed. All right, stick some
Yeah,
glue
like
on the hinges.
I mean, even as recent as like last week, weren't we talking about having multiple supply chains on? Like, right now the door is closed in terms of there's a validation that's like, oh wait, there are two supply chains we're going to bail out, and here it would be, oh, we've got some. Yeah, this would be cementing. Agree.
Right, and I think the
You
last
still wouldn't-
discussion. Sorry.
You
Go,
still wouldn't
Josh.
be able to match on multiple supply chains, right? Like you would still never select multiple supply chains. You could potentially partially match on a few different ones, but you would still only ever select the best possible one. And if it's unclear what the best possible one is, so if you had like two supply chains that match the max number of labels, then you would err, right?
Yeah, what I was saying is if a user organization came and said, oh, actually, we'd like to have two supply chains run against this one workload. If we go with this, then Cartographer would not be able to handle that case. It'd say, well, it's going to match with the best one.
It would
It's not going to
continue
match
to
with the
not,
best
right?
two.
Because it already can't.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think the discussions that often come up about multiple workloads often relate to similar use cases as this, which is there is multiple things that we'd like to see happen, and we're trying to work out how best to select for work to be done in a clear and obvious way. And this is one way. Another way might be to have multiple supply chains that can all do specific work. I know there are also some other use cases for multiple supply chains, but I'm not sure that the ones where you do very separate work are, even if they're healthy, they could probably be solved by having a single supply chain with more components. And again, it comes down to how you select for those and how complex those are. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't a reason. I'm just like, I think this is a part of that discussion, right? Around why we might have them. But I agree that it is putting cement in the locks, because now we've got not just a validation, but now also a behavior that is predicated on there only being one that should select.
Sorry, David.
This is a nice, really great conversation. If we can just document next steps, there are some next step or action item. That will be useful, so we can move to the next agenda items.
I believe there is a strong desire to have this work done soon. So we probably do need to ratify this and generate stories out of it soon. Obviously, the first work piece is, I can see your kid there, David. The first step obviously is just to put in those user scenarios, just to sort of like clarify it a bit. I feel like the selecting on fields and selecting on labels is both valuable, but we can get started with the fields a lot easier. Sorry, the labels a lot quicker. So we should probably start work on that, unless anyone has any big objections to this work.
I think as long as we just go through those scenarios and we just validate that it's going to be clear from the user experience, from the developer's point of view, that they can't choose to avoid scanning, or like we just talked, right? As long as that doesn't enable that behavior, I guess it's okay from my point. Yeah,
it doesn't enable that behavior. Yeah, it would only enable that behavior if the operator wanted.
Doesn't
So
enable that behavior any more than it exists today.
I was going to phrase
it.
I was going to phrase it in terms of the operator still has a lot of control. This gives the operator control.
But then it's also that user experience. If I remove a selector label, that gives me that if I've got the ability to do that, if I'm a developer and my interface is a workload, that for me is that I own that workload, the things are on that. So if I remove something from there, like that label selector, then it gives me the impression that I could do that. I guess maybe it's user experience or something like that.
Well, it means that you can. Normally, that would mean that you can. So if an operator wants control, they don't offer it as a characteristic.
Isn't
That
that
is
the
what
world
we
that
were trying
exists
to say.
today? Like if there's
Yes.
two supply chains in that are accessible and one of them has scanning and one of them doesn't, today, if you're the workload author, you can just put the label for the supply chain that doesn't do scanning. So it's the same thing that happens today. If you
Yes.
don't want to allow that for your developers, then
Don't
you
have the supply chain.
don't put a supply chain there, and then they can't do anything.
That is the point we were trying to make.
I was just gonna mention another approach that can be done is also like if you're already using, let's say, OPA with Gatekeeper that like lets you write those policies with like Arago, you could say, oh, the workload comes without these annotations. So the workload does not say, oh, I have these capabilities. Like I don't have the capability of being scanned. I don't have the capability of being tested. Then I don't want to take it. So like that's something that could be done at other layers as well. Even though like at the OSS layer of Cartographer, it's like it has the capability there. It's up to other layers to solve the like blocking of what can be done and what can't. I think that could be also, but like you said, very well documented and so on and so forth. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that. I think a big part we're missing here is like I don't think this is an end-all be-all feature for deciding what supply chains match what workloads. I think we're thinking about this like currently we have a problem where web test or web scan test, if you choose that label, you end up with really non-portable workloads, right? That in the selection mechanism is inverted. You're saying the workload chooses which supply chain it selects, and so this is like an iterative improvement on that keeps the workload portable, right, without creating that inverted that inversion, right? And then it's not to suggest that the developer should always be able to add those labels, and maybe that's something that's worth adding to it. Is I think a lot of us are thinking about maybe eventually we need another service that it's like a webhook that rejects labels that a developer adds, or can parse the contents of the workload and add labels automatically at the same time, right? Like I think there's additional infrastructure we can think about in the future for dealing with those policy things, but putting policy related things like scanning in this kind of makes it feel like it's like it's a direct developer use case to enable or disable scanning, and that's not really the intent. Is that I don't know, did I hit the different things okay there to make a compromise?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for bearing with me, everyone, on that one.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah, probably it's an ongoing discussion regarding this RFC. Thank you for your input. So next items, it's indeed related to this, the community meeting structure, timing. We were discussing with most of you last week that, for example, last community meeting, we had more than an hour, and most of the time was just discussing RFC 14, which is useful, it's great. There was an idea or a proposal to have a separate meeting to discuss RFCs. I've been checking this idea with some other open source projects out there. It's not that common. The proposal here is two things. First, to move the open mic discussions before RFCs because tend to be shorter than RFC discussions. And that way, if the RFC discussion needs to go beyond the 1 hour limit and the stakeholders are willing to keep the discussion longer, the discussion can happen in the same meeting. We don't need to open a separate meeting for this, and it will still be in the open. It will be recorded and uploaded to the public channel. So that way we could capture both things ideally, the suggestion from most of the community managers that I asked was to keep discussion topics at max 15 minutes and use some tool to remind you that time is about to finish, like for example, reactions. I cannot see reactions right now. Well, I was just testing some funny reactions here to remind that time is about to finish for a specific discussion. But I just wanted to know your thoughts regarding this, to have the RFC discussion at the end, or yeah, at the last section of the meeting, so it can, last longer if it's needed.
If I was to take just what we've done today as an example, we've got an RFC which we've done a quick pass on, and there's certainly some stuff that's been identified we want to put back in there, and we know we want to move quickly on it. We don't have a separate meeting this week, then our feedback cycle for then being able to check that and move forward is basically till next Wednesday. So
shouldn't the point of the RFCs be for people to be able to comment asynchronously also? Like, I think it doesn't have to be the case that the only discussion on RFCs happens in these community meetings. I think
Oh yeah, for sure.
most of it, or a lot of it, can happen in the comments.
yeah,
So
I
we
don't
could have
deny
cut the discussion shorter and continued it async.
That's even better. Mhm.
I think it's fun to, you can always set a time limit, but in terms of ordering things, I think it makes sense to go, old business, new business, and when you're considering new business, big rocks before small rocks, and RFCs I think are the biggest rocks. Those are the things that we should, if we don't get to anything else, if we get to the RFCs, then like we continue moving the project forward.
Mhm.
But does that create a barrier to entry for community members who might have smaller items to bring on and aren't yet as invested in the bigger RFCs and haven't been opening RFCs yet? Like, their discussion points may never be gotten to.
I think that we should, I think that is a problem that we should address, but I don't think that changes the question of prioritization. If somebody went to Congress and they were like, well, the average citizen can't walk in and talk about something that's really important to them. It's like, yes, that's an authentic limitation, but like, you've got to handle the big stuff first.
I also think we talked about earlier where if we had a community item, we would just talk about it first, regardless, which is, I think, another approach we could take. And then we just prioritize our own internal things as RFCs than everything else.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Imagine in the future a user has a, I don't know, basic question that he or she wants to bring to the meeting. We need to be sure that gets the proper priority, and also longer, deeper discussions have their place, but users are not waiting until the end to have a question answered.
So I thought when you want to talk with people, and I think it's a incredibly valuable thing to be able to have a talk, a chat, right? Because it's the only way I actually soak things up personally. That's kind of an office hours concept. All right, come and chat with us, tell us about what's on your mind, and I wouldn't mind having that.
Yeah, also I checked the office hours, let's say schema here. With the projects, it's always users or contributors out there coming here with questions to the maintainers team. So if it's not always for deep dive discussions on a single RFC, for example.
Right. I'm just talking about that message about when people want to ask us some basic question or any kind of question that's not RFC related. We were talking about prioritizing those first.
Okay.
I feel like having an office hours meeting for those kinds of questions, so that this one's more formally around design decisions, right? And team health, so that the office hours is a space for people to talk, maybe also feel that they can do so informally, right? Then they're not
Yeah.
racing to be part of an agenda, they just get to have a talk. And
So the community office hours that I've been involved in for the last 6 years, we tend to use half of, or try to get half of the hour using demos, people discussing things. Also, oh sorry, Steve, I didn't really see your hand up there, by the way, I just jumped in. But yeah, if there's people that have something to bring up, maybe introduce an RFC. But I mean, I went far too long on that. I should have added my comments onto the RFC directly, to Marty's point. But not everybody can always make the office hours either, whether that's work time, but also different parts of the world as well. So it's also what we want people to be able to view back on recordings and give them some eye candy and get them to engage into the Slack channels and comments on RFCs, which can handle asynchronously as well. Sorry, Stephen.
I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. I worry a little bit about the framing of, it seems like we're saying internal discussion, us, like maybe maintainers group as a synonym for a VMware or something like that, versus community things and talking about external issues, right? Like, I think we should kind of avoid that framing if we can, and think about it like, there are people who happen to have elevated privileges to merge PRs in the repo, but if somebody tomorrow from another company or just somebody in the community showed up here and had ideas, that we'd treat those ideas with the same kind of rigor as somebody who is a maintainer and opened a PR or an issue, right? Like, if there are ways we can focus on a process that doesn't kind of prioritize our own or like PRs and suggestions by maintainers, right, over separately or over things that come from the community, I think it really help in making the project more accessible. But I say that with the knowledge that we haven't had any external contribution yet, right? But also it does seem like we maybe do need more time to chat with to have open community meetings, and it's going to be really hard to do that if we schedule those one off, because people aren't going to know that they're happening, right? And so even though I believe things should move towards being more asynchronous, and we should embrace the community more, right? If we need 2 hours of meetings a week, Cloud Unit Build Packs has 3 right now, even though it is a little bit larger. So I don't think it's that unusual, however we want to frame them.
Yeah. Okay. So, in summary, at least for now, we'll say that we need to agree on some things. Probably basic questions from users are not the most common thing on community meeting. Now that I think better, probably that kind of questions are for Slack channels. That's the most usual place to where users go for basic things. When there are larger discussions from community members, at least from my experience, probably a separate office hours make sense for that. So for now, I don't know. I would say that we can keep this structure as is, just moving the shorter discussions before RFCs. Well, that will go against the big rocks, small rocks principle. Just to ensure that we are not rushing on RFC discussions, because we agree that they are important. And also, as we see how it goes and how it progresses, we will need to consider framing a separate office hours. That for some open source projects here, it's been a bi-weekly thing, and some other projects are not doing it anymore. But certainly for Cartographer, it could work, right? Many things happen. So that will be my proposal so far. I don't know. And again, to keep it, I think you can also comment here on the topic in the agenda and can reach an agreement.
Does anybody feel strongly like we need more meeting hours sooner? Because I know that one thing was brought up is that we're trying to, in the next couple of weeks, kind of get through a number of RFCs. One thing I didn't hear there is like a plan to extend the amount of time we have open meetings a week in the near future. Does anybody feel strongly one way or another about that?
Yes, I also say yes.
Yeah, and the reason I'm saying yes, just to back that up, is that I do not want to have something we're trying to rush through and trying to push through that doesn't get some open review. So it'd be nice to be able to have the opportunity to ensure we get some of that.
I think as long as it doesn't push us away from working asynchronously, right? As long as we're using the time for discussions that really need to happen, face to face, and we reevaluate later, it doesn't seem like a bad idea to me.
Good. Yeah, one final thing. Will you say that it should be a weekly, bi-weekly? What would be the cadence for this?
Weekly at the moment.
Yeah. So. Okay, you can also comment there if you have different ideas. No problem. Thank you for this. Okay, next thing, testing practices. Mori.
Is there not something else before that?
Yeah, I just moved it.
Oh, okay.
Give you something.
We don't have a ton of time, but I just want to bring up, like, we started talking a bunch of weeks ago about settling on testing practices that we're going to follow. We never really finished that discussion, and the current state of the code is, you'll see different tests depending on, or different style of tests depending on who happened to have worked on that piece of code, or who most recently touched it and decided to refactor it into their style of choice, I guess. And it just seems unsustainable, and certainly higher barrier of entry for newcomers to try and like learn different testing styles and figure out what tests are right where, and what even is like if someone wants to make a contribution, like what type of test do you write? And that to be more specific, like some people write integration level tests, some people write cuddle tests, and those are usually used like mutually exclusively. But even within like unit testing, just like the way we format them and the nesting structures and things like that, it's just like they all look different, and it seems a little unsustainable. And I don't know how to come to a decision. Maybe that's like a PR or something, or an RFC to like add to our contributing doc, like a testing thing, and maybe we could talk about it in the context of that type of RFC. I wanted to know what y'all thought.
Yeah, I wonder if this is one of those things that, like, as we do the reviews and as the team gets like more settled on an approach, it's something that like will come up during the review process as we're like giving feedback about the code being produced. I think like a style guide can be useful, but it's only as useful as we enforce it, right? Like as reviewers looking at the code, we actually like provide suggestions that match the style guide. And yeah, linting wise, there's so much linting can do too. I'm not super sure.
Yeah, I'd be happy to wait until like we've settled on an approach, but I just don't see us even moving towards settling on an approach right now. I think we're just continuing to diverge. So maybe like we're not ready for a style guide yet, but I feel like if we're not ready for that, then we need some other mechanism of moving towards converging on a style.
Yeah, definitely like talking about it, seeing like the things that we like, the things we don't like is that could be probably like a good place to start, and then like experiment enforcing it in the next reviews. That could be maybe a good move. What do you think?
I guess like in what context do we have that discussion? Like at one of
Yeah.
these meetings, do we take it offline and decide as like a set of contributors ourselves how we want to follow and not make that an open discussion? Or do we do it in some sort of PR or some sort of Slack thread? Like, it's like, I don't even know how to have the discussion right now.
So we're starting off with an issue to outline the problem and then try and start getting people's thoughts, possible ideas down on that.
I've seen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a number of the folks in this conversation took a crack at a testing convo a little bit ago and didn't come to an agreement. I wonder if we want to do something more formal where we have some examples of like, here's a pattern, here's another pattern, they're in conflict, have a talk and then take a vote. I guess one quite like the fact that we didn't come to consensus last time seems to make it less likely that we would come to consensus. So it moves us more towards a majoritarian approach.
Personally, I think an issue would be good to capture this, exactly what the problem is, and try and get people to chime in. And I think it would be really good. And then come back to the call, because I'm pretty sure most people can't remember a lot of the discussions or thought points were in the last meeting you referred to. So we'll probably lose those things. And if we can get them down into an issue, then it will help jog our memory, because it's not going to be solved overnight. But
I thought in the last discussion we mostly agreed personally, so it's also something that's interesting. Like I just remember that we mostly agreed on things, and I felt like there's been less churn lately. So
maybe it's another reason why we can have it. If we haven't had an issue, then we'd have that whatever exactly. Track it exactly. Yeah.
It could just be
if
treading over that old code again, right? And then finding these old patterns somewhere that just no one had been in there, right?
Minimally, I have been wherever I feel like so I think this is another action item to take from this is when I feel like I am changing a style that has changed recently, and this is not just in testing, but in code, instead of just changing it, I at the very least throw something into the public chat about what I'm seeing, but I've seen no response to any of that. So I don't know how to drive it if we're being averse to having the conversation or what, but like, I just want to get, like, even if it's there, at least it's documented. We can then, if we have an issue for styles or we build up the contributing guide for the section on styles, we can just add what we have agreed on by having those discussions. They can happen asynchronously, is what I'm saying. All right. As well, I still think it's a good idea to have an issue around testing, especially around anything that people still feel is a major issue. But I'm just saying as well, you see something, you see it, feel like you're about to thrash, because I hate that feeling more than doing the thing I don't like, right? If I'm like, oh, I'm just changing the code back again, then I throw something in the chat. And so there's an example of that for, I don't like horizontal/vertical lists in var declarations. And there's one of those in the chat, just by way of example, right? Whether I like it or not, I bring it up before I just keep on committing my changes, right? Or along with committing my changes, but say, you know, this thing seems to be a point of contention, let's deal with it.
There's a link for that, probably somewhere.
Anything else regarding this last point?
Sounds like I can open an issue and we can continue the discussion.
Okay. I'll put it as an action item. And if there's not anything else, thank you so much for your time. See you next week.
Cheers.
Thank you.